The explosion lit up the sky over the Black Sea before most people in Novorossiysk had even finished their morning coffee. It was March 2, 2026, and Ukraine had just struck one of the most strategically vital pieces of infrastructure in all of Russia. Not a military base in some remote corner of the country, not a logistics depot buried deep inside Russian territory. Ukraine hit the jugular. The Sheskharis oil terminal, the single most important petroleum export hub Russia has on the Black Sea, went up in flames, and within hours the entire port of Novorossiysk had suspended loading operations. 5 people were wounded, 20 buildings were damaged, a fuel terminal caught fire, and the shockwaves of that attack were felt not just in the Krasnodar region, but in oil markets, military command centers, and foreign ministries from Moscow to Washington to Riyadh. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand what Novorossiysk actually is. Most people outside of the energy industry have never heard the name. But if you follow the money, if you follow the oil, if you trace the financial lifelines that have allowed Russia to sustain its war machine for more than 3 years of brutal conflict in Ukraine, you will inevitably arrive at this port city on the northeastern edge of the Black Sea. Novorossiysk is not just a city, it is a choke point. It is the artery through which Russia pumps hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude oil every single day into the global market, turning its vast reserves of petroleum into the hard currency it desperately needs to fund soldiers, weapons, ammunition, and the entire industrial apparatus of a war economy. The Sheskharis terminal specifically is the crown jewel of that infrastructure. It has a loading capacity of 700,000 barrels of crude oil per day. Think about that number for a moment. 700,000 barrels every single day. That oil flows out of pipelines from the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, which connects the massive oil fields of Kazakhstan to the Black Sea coast, and from Russian domestic production. It gets loaded onto supertankers that carry it across the Black Sea and through the Turkish Straits into the Mediterranean, and from there to buyers all over the world. Without Sheskharis operating at full capacity, Russia's ability to monetize its oil exports takes a serious hit. And without those export revenues, the financial pressure on the Kremlin ratchets up significantly. Now here is where the story gets even more extraordinary. According to a Ukrainian security service officer who spoke publicly about the operation, Ukrainian drones did not just graze the perimeter of the terminal, they hit 6 of its 7 loading facilities. 6 out of 7. That is not a lucky strike. That is precision targeting on a scale that demonstrates a level of operational sophistication that Ukraine's armed forces have been quietly developing for years, even as the world focused on the bloody trench warfare in the Donbass and the dramatic battles on the Eastern Front. The SBU official also stated that beyond the petroleum infrastructure, the drones struck Russian warships anchored in the port and hit a naval base, as well as an S-400 surface-to-air missile defense system. The S-400 is one of Russia's most prized air defense assets, a system that Moscow has sold to countries around the world and marketed as virtually impenetrable. If it was damaged in Novorossiysk on the morning of March 2nd, that is a symbolic and military blow that cannot be understated. Russia, for its part, acknowledged the attack in the particular way that Russia always acknowledges attacks it does not want to fully discuss. The Ministry of Defense in Moscow announced that Russian air defenses had intercepted and destroyed 172 Ukrainian drones during the night. 172 drones. Of those, 67 were reportedly shot down over the Black Sea and 66 over the Krasnodar region, which is the administrative territory where Novorossiysk is located. The numbers themselves are staggering. This was not a probe or a test. This was a massive, coordinated drone offensive. And even if Russia's claim of 172 intercepted drones is entirely accurate, the fact that enough of them got through to set the Sheskharis terminal on fire, wound 5 people, damaged 20 buildings, and forced the suspension of port operations tells you everything you need to know about the limits of Russian air defense. No system, no matter how sophisticated, can achieve a perfect interception rate against a swarm of that size. Ukraine clearly understood that, and it designed this attack to exploit exactly that vulnerability. The Russian government notably made no mention of any damage to its military equipment, its warships, or its S-400 system. This is consistent with a long-standing pattern of information control that Moscow has enforced since the very beginning of the war in 2022. Russian law effectively criminalizes the public disclosure of military losses, and the state media apparatus dutifully avoids reporting anything that could be interpreted as a military setback. So when Ukrainian officials claim that warships were hit and a major air defense system was damaged, and Russia says nothing about those claims at all, the silence becomes its own form of evidence. Reuters, to its credit, noted that it could not independently verify which specific targets had been struck beyond what was confirmed on the civilian side. That is the honest answer in a fog of war situation. But the operational disruption at the port is not in dispute. The mayor of Novorossiysk confirmed publicly that residential blocks and kindergartens had been damaged. A state of emergency was declared in the city. 3 commercial sources with direct knowledge of operations at the terminal told Reuters that loading had been suspended. These are not propaganda claims from either side. These are the on-the-ground realities of a major port city that suddenly found itself in the center of a war that many of its residents perhaps assumed was happening somewhere far away in the east. And here's the point that deserves close attention. For Ukraine, attacking Novorossiysk is not just about destroying infrastructure for the sake of it. It is about applying maximum economic pressure on Russia at a moment when the Kremlin's war financing is already under significant strain. Russia has been running elevated military expenditure since 2022, with defense spending consuming an ever larger share of the national budget. Estimates from independent economists and Western intelligence assessments suggest that Russia has been spending somewhere between 6 and 8% of its GDP on defense annually, a level that is sustainable in the short term, but creates serious structural vulnerabilities over time. Oil and gas revenues represent roughly a third of the Russian federal budget, and a significant portion of that comes through the Black Sea export corridor. Every day that Sheskharis is offline, every cargo that cannot be loaded, every supertanker that sits idle waiting for the terminal to reopen is a day of revenue that Russia does not recover. It is money that does not go to pay soldiers, does not fund artillery shell production, does not service the financial obligations of a wartime state. Ukraine has been developing its drone warfare capabilities with remarkable speed and creativity throughout this conflict. What began in 2022 with relatively simple commercial drone adaptations for reconnaissance and small-scale attack missions has evolved into something that strategic analysts are now watching with genuine fascination. Ukrainian engineers, working with a combination of domestic production, foreign components, and battlefield ingenuity, have developed long-range attack drones capable of flying hundreds of kilometers and hitting targets with meaningful precision. The attacks on Russian refineries, fuel depots, and now the Sheskharis terminal are part of a coherent strategic campaign. Ukraine cannot match Russia in conventional artillery or armor at scale, but it has identified a category of infrastructure attack that Russia is structurally vulnerable to, and it has systematically targeted that vulnerability for months. The Caspian Pipeline Consortium, which routes Kazakhstani oil through Russian territory to the Sheskharis terminal, is an interesting geopolitical element in this story that does not get enough attention. Kazakhstan, which is nominally part of Russia's sphere of influence and a member of various Russian-led multilateral organizations, has been quietly diversifying its oil export routes precisely because of the risks associated with routing through Russian infrastructure that has now become a legitimate military target. The attack on March 2nd will only accelerate those conversations. If you are a Kazakhstani energy minister or a Western oil company with contracts tied to Caspian output, The idea that the primary Black Sea export terminal for that oil can be shut down in a single night by Ukrainian drones is a fact that demands a strategic response. Alternative routes through the Caucasus, through Turkey, through other pipelines that bypass Russian territory entirely will suddenly look much more attractive. And that is a long-term geopolitical consequence that extends far beyond the immediate military calculus of this single attack. If you are finding this analysis valuable, if this is the kind of depth that you have been looking for and not finding in the regular news cycle, please take a second right now to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. This is what we do here every single time a story like this breaks. We do not just tell you what happened, we tell you why it matters and what it means for the world you live in. Now let us continue. The Russian military response claim of 172 intercepted drones deserves its own analysis. The Russian air defense network, which includes the S-400, the Pantsir short-range systems, and various electronic warfare assets, has been significantly stressed throughout this war. Ukraine has forced Russia to commit enormous resources to air defense coverage, not just at the front lines, but across a vast swath of Russian territory that stretches from the border regions all the way back to Moscow. Every drone attack that Ukraine launches, even if it is intercepted, consumes Russian air defense missiles that cost money and time to replace. The S-400 system uses missiles that are expensive to produce and not trivially replaceable on a rapid timeline. When Ukraine launches 172 drones in a single night, even if Russia shoots down 172 of them, the attrition equation is working in Ukraine's favor if the cost per drone is significantly lower than the cost per interceptor missile. And in many cases, it is. This is the arithmetic of drone warfare that has been quietly reshaping the economics of modern military conflict, and Novorossiysk is one of the clearest demonstrations of that dynamic we have seen so far. The strategic significance of the Black Sea itself has shifted dramatically since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Before the war, the Black Sea was primarily understood as a regional waterway with economic importance for the countries that border it, namely Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, and Georgia. It was a zone of occasional tension, but not a genuine active war zone. That changed the moment Russian warships began launching cruise missiles from the Black Sea against Ukrainian cities, and it changed again when Ukraine demonstrated, with a combination of naval drones and anti-ship missiles, that it could contest Russian naval dominance in those waters. The sinking of the Moskva, Russia's Black Sea Fleet flagship in April 2022, was a watershed moment. It showed the world that Ukraine was willing and able to strike major Russian military assets at sea, and it set the stage for the kind of sustained campaign against Russian maritime and port infrastructure that culminated in the attack on Novorossiysk on March 2, 2026. Russia's ability to project naval power in the Black Sea has been significantly curtailed over the past 3 years. Multiple Russian warships have been damaged or destroyed by Ukrainian naval drones and missiles. The Black Sea Fleet has increasingly pulled its surface vessels back to ports further from the Ukrainian coastline in an attempt to reduce their exposure to attack. Novorossiysk became one of the primary refuge ports for those vessels, which is precisely why Ukraine targeted it. By going after Novorossiysk, Ukraine was not just attacking an oil export terminal. It was attacking the last major safe harbor that Russia believed it had for its Black Sea naval assets. If the Ukrainian SBU officials' claim that warships were hit in the attack is accurate, then Russia's naval retreat has not provided the protection Moscow hoped it would. The global oil market reaction to this attack will be worth watching closely in the hours and days following the strike. Crude oil prices are notoriously sensitive to supply disruption events, particularly when they involve major export infrastructure. The Sheskharis terminal handles an enormous volume of oil, and even a short suspension of operations represents a meaningful reduction in supply hitting the global market. The Caspian Pipeline Consortium routes, in addition to Russian domestic Urals crude, account for a significant share of the oil that flows through the Turkish Straits into Mediterranean markets. If buyers who had cargoes scheduled for loading in the coming days find themselves unable to receive those shipments, they will need to source replacement barrels from elsewhere, and that scramble has a price effect. For countries that rely on Russian Black Sea crude exports, including several European nations that have maintained energy trade relationships with Moscow despite the war, the attack on Novorossiysk is a direct financial and logistical problem. There is also a diplomatic dimension to this story that operates beneath the surface. Turkey controls access to the Black Sea through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has spent years carefully managing his country's position as an intermediary between Russia and the West. Turkey has refused to impose sanctions on Russia, has maintained energy trade with Moscow, and has positioned itself as a potential mediator in any eventual peace process. But Turkey is also a NATO member, and the expansion of the conflict to include sustained attacks on major Russian port and petroleum infrastructure in the Black Sea region creates complications for Ankara's carefully balanced position. Every escalation in the Black Sea raises the question of how long Turkey can maintain that balance before the pressure from NATO allies on one side and Russian economic interests on the other becomes untenable. What happens next is the question everyone with a stake in this conflict is asking right now. Ukraine has demonstrated once again that it can reach deep into Russian-controlled territory and hit targets of enormous strategic and economic value. Russia will attempt to restore operations at the Sheskharis terminal as quickly as possible, and Russian engineers have shown throughout this war a degree of resilience and repair capability that should not be underestimated. But repairing 6 out of 7 loading facilities that have been struck by precision drones is not a quick operation. The financial cost of the disruption will accrue daily, and the message that Ukraine has sent to every oil trader, every shipping company, every insurance underwriter, and every energy ministry that does business through Novorossiysk is clear. This terminal is not safe. It is a target, and Ukraine is willing and able to hit it again. For the Russian population of Novorossiysk, waking up on March 2, 2026, to find that kindergartens had been damaged and residential blocks were in ruins was a jarring reminder that the war is not confined to the front lines. Russian state media and Russian government officials have worked consistently throughout this conflict to insulate the civilian population from the direct experience of the war, to present the special military operation as something happening far away in Ukraine, not in Russian cities. That fiction has been progressively harder to maintain. Drone attacks on Moscow, on Belgorod, on oil refineries in the Saratov and Ryazan regions, and now this strike on Novorossiysk all puncture the narrative of a clean, controlled military operation being conducted at a safe distance. When a kindergarten gets damaged, it becomes personal in a way that statistics on the front cannot replicate. The broader context of this attack includes the ongoing international diplomatic maneuvering around a potential ceasefire or peace framework. Throughout early 2026, various international actors have floated different proposals, different conditions, different timelines for a negotiated end to the conflict. Ukraine's position throughout those discussions has been that it will not accept a ceasefire that legitimizes Russian territorial gains, and its willingness to conduct large-scale strikes deep inside Russia, including on critical economic infrastructure, is part of how it communicates that position. Every attack, like the one on Novorossiysk on March 2nd, is a signal that Ukraine is not running out of capability, is not desperate for relief, and is not going to accept terms that do not include a genuine restoration of its territorial integrity. It is military action as diplomatic communication. For Russia, the attack creates a serious credibility problem. Moscow has spent considerable effort projecting an image of unassailability, of a state with robust defenses and an ability to control the terms of this conflict. a single night in which Ukraine launches 172 drones, destroys a major oil export terminal, potentially damages warships and an S-400 system, wounds 5 people, and forces a state of emergency in a major Russian city is not consistent with that image. How Moscow responds in the coming days will be watched carefully. Russia has a history of responding to significant Ukrainian strikes with massive missile and drone attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, particularly the power grid. That cycle of attack and retaliation has been one of the defining rhythms of this war, and there is every reason to expect it to continue. The larger story here is the transformation of warfare that this conflict is demonstrating to the entire world. Military planners in every major country are watching how Ukraine has used asymmetric capabilities, particularly long-range drones and naval surface drones, to contest the power of a state with vastly superior conventional military resources. The lessons of the Black Sea, of the drone campaign against Russian refineries and ports, are being absorbed by militaries from Europe to Asia to the Middle East. The calculus of what it costs to attack critical infrastructure versus what it costs to defend it is being rewritten in real time, and the events of March 2, 2026, in Novorossiysk are another chapter in that rewriting. What we witnessed on the morning of March 2, 2026, was not just an attack on an oil terminal. It was a demonstration of the reach, the precision, and the strategic ambition of Ukraine's long war campaign against Russia's economic and military backbone. The Sheskharis terminal, with its 700,000 barrel per day capacity, is not a random target. It was chosen because hitting it hurts Russia, where it is most vulnerable, in the revenue stream that funds the war. The naval assets hit in the same attack, if the Ukrainian claims are confirmed, represent an assault on Russia's last credible surface naval presence in the Black Sea. The damage to a residential city and the declaration of a state of emergency are the collateral consequences of a war that Russia chose to start and that Ukraine has chosen to fight with every tool available to it. The war in Ukraine is not winding down. It is not frozen. It is not at a stalemate in any meaningful sense of that word. It is evolving, and Ukraine's capacity for strategic reach, for hitting the economic and military infrastructure that sustains Russia's war effort, is growing. The attack on Novorossiysk is a marker of that evolution. It will not end the war on its own. No single attack ever ends a war. But it adds pressure to a system that is already under enormous stress, and it sends a message that reaches far beyond the burning fuel terminal on the Black Sea coast. What do you think the long-term consequences of this attack will be for Russia's oil export capacity and for the broader trajectory of the conflict? Leave your perspective in the comments below. This is a story that is still unfolding, and the analysis will deepen as more information becomes available. If you want to stay ahead of it, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next update.